Number 9. Takamasa Itatsu. Former Kamikaze pilot Takamasa Itatsu was 89 years old when he spoke with a BBC reporter about his wartime experiences. He explained that he survived his final mission because his plane experienced engine trouble, forcing him to ditch in the sea. Kamikaze pilots who returned from their missions were grouped into two categories: those who failed to carry out their orders due to factors that were outside of their control, and those who aborted their missions due to psychological reasons. Because Itatsu came back to his unit due to mechanical problems, he fell into the group of pilots who were not frowned upon or punished for returning alive. It would have been much different if he had turned back out of fear, which would have labeled him a coward and subjected him to harsh punishment. But even those who were accused of chickening out of their final flight were spared from punishment because the Japanese were already at a shortage of skilled pilots. Their missions were rescheduled and their superiors ensured that they remained in condition to fly. There was a limit on how many times a pilot could return, however, and at one point, the Japanese military announced that any kamikaze pilot who returned from missions 9 times would be executed. Itatsu's final flight was never rescheduled because the war ended. For years, he kept quiet about his role in the war and was riddled with survivor's guilt. He even considered taking his own life many times. It wasn't until the 1970s when Itatsu began asking the families of fallen comrades for mementos and photos of the men that his healing journey began. Over the years, he amassed a huge collection which includes farewell letters written by kamikaze pilots. Through his efforts to preserve their memory, Itatsu finally came to terms with his survival and felt a sense of purpose. Number 8. Kaoru Hasegawa. On May 25, 1945, kamikaze pilot Kaoru Hasegawa zeroed in on the American ship USS San Francisco as his suicide target in the waters off Okinawa. As he began his approach, his plane was shot down by gunners who fired from the nearby USS West Virginia and USS Callahan. In keeping with the standard practice of rescuing any surviving friends or foes, sailors plucked Hasegawa from the water and brought him aboard the Callahan. He was unconscious and later told the Spokesman Review that when he awoke, he thought he was going to be executed. Instead, Hasegawa and the American service members who rescued him exchanged forgiveness and mementos and embraced each other before he was transferred to another battleship and then sent to a POW camp in Hawaii. He was eventually released and returned to Japan to live out what was, by all accounts, a normal life. But Hasegawa never forgot about the men aboard the Callahan who saved his life, and how the exchange taught him a lesson about how former enemies can become friends. He spent a year tracking the crew members down through military records and then traveled to the U.S. in 1995, 50 years after the harrowing rescue, to thank them personally at an emotional reunion. During his visit, Hasegawa visited the Navy Memorial in Washington, where he laid a wreath and donated $10,000 to the memorial fund in honor of the crew. Number 7. Hisao Horiyama. When 21-year-old Hisao Horiyama received a piece of paper in late 1944 asking if he was willing to kill himself in the name of the Japanese war effort, he readily volunteered. As it became clear that Japan was losing the war, he saw it as his duty to step up and do whatever was necessary to try helping his country regain an upper hand, even if that meant flying a plane into an American ship knowing full well that he wouldn't survive. Horiyama felt even more strongly called to the cause when the emperor visited his unit on a white horse, later telling the Guardian that it was as if the leader was personally requesting their services. In addition to his loyalty to his country, Horiyama said that he and his fellow soldiers were conditioned to suppress their emotions. So when it came to the prospect of dying, they reacted much differently than most people probably would and simply accepted what they thought was their destiny. Horiyama never went on the flight of death he had prepared for by the time Japan surrendered, and he initially felt guilty for not making the ultimate sacrifice for his country. He later recalled feeling like he had let down a lot of people, including his father, who he was trying to prove himself to. Shortly before she died, Horiyama's mother told him that she never would have forgiven his father if she had lost a son in a kamikaze attack, perhaps offering the man some long-awaited reassurance that his survival was a good thing. Number 6. Kazuo Odachi. Kazuo Odachi was just 17 years old when he became a kamikaze pilot for the Japanese Navy. By then, he was pretty sure that Japan would lose the war, and he was willing to die for his country, but had conflicted feelings about the difference between a meaningful sacrifice and throwing his life away. He nevertheless volunteered for the role and went through the training with the expectation that at some point it would be his turn to die for the war effort. After surviving the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Odachi escaped to Taiwan. Starting in April 1945, he was sent on several suicide bombing missions over a 10-month period. He managed to survive each time for one reason or another and was about to embark on yet another suicide flight when a fellow military member ran out to the runway and stopped him. The emperor had just surrendered and the war was finally officially over. Odachi moved on with his life. He got married and never spoke about his past as a kamikaze pilot, even to his wife, out of a fear that people would judge or stereotype him. Finally, in 2016, he started opening up about his role in the war as the attitudes and culture surrounding it began to change. He even wrote a book called Memoirs of a Kamikaze, which came out on the 75th anniversary of the war's end. Speaking with the New York Times, Odachi said that he hoped his story would remind people of the humanity of the kamikaze pilots whose lives were sacrificed and the pressure they were under to fulfill Imperial Japan's vision. He summed up his thoughts into a poignant statement: "There wasn't a single person among us who would have decided on their own to die." Number 5. Hisashi Tetsuka. Hisashi Tetsuka was among a group of university students who were drafted in 1945 as the Japanese military sought to replenish its depleting soldiers. One day, he and other recruits were asked whether they were willing to go on a suicide mission. They had 3 options for their response: to volunteer eagerly, to simply volunteer, or to say that they wished not to join. While most of the pilots knew their answers right away and were soon out the door, Tetsuka and several others found themselves having conflicting feelings. He later said that he didn't particularly want to become a kamikaze pilot, but felt obligated to serve what felt like a duty to his nation and family, so he ultimately volunteered. Tetsuka was granted 5 days leave to visit his family before the planned mission, but couldn't bear to tell them about the role he had taken on. Like many other kamikaze pilots, he was stopped short of his final mission by Japan's surrender while en route to his base to carry out the attack. He later told the press at 93 years old that his mind went blank upon realizing that he wasn't about to die. He moved on with his life and started a business as he found himself too sick of war to remain in the military and unfazed by the prospect of flying a commercial jet. By all accounts, Tetsuka lived an average but fulfilling life after the war. He had grandchildren and even became friends with some American farmers who were living in Japan, although he kept quiet about his role in the war when he went to see them. If you were drafted into the military and asked to be a kamikaze pilot, which of the 3 options would be your response? Let us know in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. Ryozo Kotoge. Imperial Japanese Navy pilot Ryozo Kotoge was just 17 years old when he received orders for what was supposed to be his final mission. The young man had just witnessed the bombing of Nagasaki from a neighboring city when he was told to prepare for an attack against the Americans. Like many others, Kotoge's life was saved at the 11th hour when Japan surrendered to the Allies shortly before his scheduled departure. He waited for a truck to come pick him up, but it never arrived. Kotoge didn't fully understand what was going on until several days later when he managed to tune into a radio broadcast from Emperor Hirohito announcing that Japan had lost the war. His unit was demobilized a week later and he was sent home. In hindsight, he thinks he received his suicide mission orders late because he had to receive treatment for malaria, and that this may have also played a key role in saving his life. Speaking with the Asahi Shimbun in 2020 at the age of 92, Kotoge explained that he initially suffered from survivor's guilt, but was glad to return to his hometown. While traveling there, his train unexpectedly stopped in Hiroshima, where he stepped outside and saw human bodies being piled up and lit on fire. Like Nagasaki, the US had dropped a nuclear bomb on the city, causing mass civilian casualties and leveling much of it to the ground. He went on to work for his local government and mostly kept quiet about his wartime experience until after he retired. He began opening up after being invited to his grandkids' school to talk about it, which led to him speaking at numerous other schools. Kotoge became a staunch advocate for peace after the war and said that he thinks it's important to pass his story on to younger generations to prevent such destructive violence from happening ever again in Japan. Number 3. Yoshimi Yanai. Unlike many kamikaze pilots who were spared from going on their final missions by Japan's surrender, Yoshimi Yanai lived because he failed to locate his target during what was supposed to be his suicide flight. This type of error was reportedly rare for a kamikaze operation, making Yanai's survival notably exceptional. By the time he departed for the mission, he had written his final words to his parents. He kept it for the rest of his life, along with a collection of photos that show him and his fellow soldiers enjoying some happy moments before embarking on what was, for many, the last flight of their lives. Yanai was just one of the many kamikaze pilots that author Maxwell Taylor Kennedy sought to understand better for his 2008 book called Danger's Hour. Kennedy was surprised to find that instead of encountering radicals who had harbored extreme ideologies, he met with men who weren't much different from young people from the US or any other country who found themselves feeling conflicted between their patriotism and other values. In this sense, learning about the kamikaze pilots has helped to humanize their experience and look past long-held stereotypes and misunderstandings. Number 2. Kenichiro Unuki. Kamikaze pilot Kenichiro Unuki was on his way to attack an American fleet off Okinawa in 1945 when his plane experienced sudden engine problems. He landed the aircraft and was rescued by the Japanese Navy, who questioned him about his mission's failure. In the meantime, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, bringing the war to an end. It meant that Unuki no longer had to carry out his suicide mission. 60 years later, he told the History Net journalist Lawrence Rees that his survival had left him with a sense of burden. Unuki knew that he wasn't supposed to be alive, but he saw it as an opportunity to dispel common myths and stereotypes surrounding kamikaze pilots, including the widely held notion that they eagerly killed themselves for what they saw as a greater imperial cause. Like many others who found themselves being asked the same question, Unuki and some of his fellow soldiers felt both conflicted and flabbergasted by the request to participate in the so-called special mission. But they worried that there would be consequences if they didn't volunteer, including perhaps the social alienation of their families or their parents being told that they were a coward and a failure. The men also suspected that if they failed to sign up as kamikaze pilots, they'd be sent to the most dangerous parts of the war, where they'd likely die anyway, but in a less honorable way. Unuki ultimately volunteered and spent the next several months training for his final flight. His first scheduled departure was canceled due to mechanical issues. He flew out the next day, mentally prepared to die, but a faulty engine spared his life. Number 1. Takahiko Aina. 20-year-old Takahiko Aina was drafted into the Japanese Navy in April 1945, by which point the country's military was fighting a losing battle in the war. He was sent to the island of Kyushu, where he was told that he and 2 other men would pilot a bomb-laden plane into an Allied ship with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. Aina's orders were part of a mission codenamed Operation Kikusui, which sought to bomb Allied vessels during the Battle of Okinawa. By then, many of Japan's fighter planes had become obsolete against the enemy's rapidly advancing technology. The aircraft were stripped and refitted specifically for suicide missions, but they often experienced mechanical issues along the way and were shot down. Aina was unable to even get his plane off the ground for his first scheduled mission, and he was forced to make an emergency landing after taking off for a second planned bombing due to engine trouble. During his third flight, Aina's plane experienced engine trouble, forcing him to crash land in the sea. He survived the ditching and was rescued, and by the time a Japanese submarine came to retrieve him, the country had surrendered. While the war's end left some surviving kamikaze pilots feeling like they had failed to fulfill their duty, Aina was relieved. He told The Guardian in 2015 at 92 years old that while he felt sad about the friends he'd lost, he looked forward to the rebuilding of Japan. Even in his older years, decades after the war's end, Aina praised the country's pacifist constitution, which avoids war at all costs. Thanks for watching. What did you think of these stories from former kamikaze pilots? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.